Okay, so we're going to continue on with React, and today I'm going to just kind of lightly start talking about lifecycle methods. And so they're methods if you use class components, they're hooks if you're using functional components. But basically, React kind of manages your components for you, and it will call certain things in a certain order. And it allows you to hook into those things or tap into those things or override those methods when they're called and do certain things at certain points in the so-called life cycle. So React uses this term lifecycle and lifecycle methods, which in some sense sounds like it's a new thing, but it's really it's not really a new thing conceptually. So I'm just going to show you an example in Python. The same kind of concept. So I've got React. So this is the React app we're going to start with today for the lecture, but I'm going to just create a throwaway Python file. So in Python, I'm going to create a normal class. So class. And I'm going to, since as we usually do, I'm going to override the init. And I'm not really going to do anything. I'll just kind of print. So we can see when it's being called. So print init called. And there's a few other, so when we create a class, in Python, there are a few built-in, a few built-in methods that we can override, and this is obviously one of them. This is the one that we are most familiar with overriding. There are other things. So we've seen that, for example, if I do so if I run this file, so I'm just calling dir on a list, so I can just see all of the stuff that's available to me here, and there's a whole bunch of stuff, including dir. So dir itself is a dunder method. So when you call dir like this as a function, Python is actually calling that. So this is kind of like an alias. But there's a whole bunch of things like new, for example, is one of them. Init is one of them. Iter. So what does iter do?
I'm gonna say context clues and say it iterates.
Yeah. So it's how it's basically if you put this in a for loop, this is what's going to get called. So we saw with the context manager using the with keyword, there's an enter and an exit dunder. This doesn't have that, but basically there are all these methods that you can override and customize to get your class to behave like native Python objects. So that in general shouldn't be new information for you. So here we're overriding the init, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. You can see that there's where's that? There's new, and there should be it's not a delete, but well, okay. So there are a few other ones. So let's also override this new and see what happens. So def new, and the signature here is going to be a little bit different. It's actually going to take an instance of the class and then some optional, just to be safe, we'll give it args and kwargs. And then I'm going to print new called. And then I'm gonna have to call super because there's some stuff that's happening here. You don't really need to worry about this. It's just to get it to work. And there's also a delete. So del. So what happens when I create an instance of my class? Not really going to do anything other than create an instance and then let the program run to completion. So if I do this, let's see. Why did init not get called? Oh yeah, sorry. So you can see that all three of these methods ran, and they ran in a particular order. So even though we have init first and new, it's actually new gets called first, and then init, and then delete. So when you create a new instance of a class, Python will, Python has its own kind of routine for doing this. So there's an expected protocol or series of actions, series of method calls, which you could call, lifecycle methods for creating a class. And the first one is going to call as new. And you don't need to worry about what new does, but new is basically just going to create the class, and then init will initialize it. So init will give it all of the instance, the specific instance properties that you want to have. So it calls new first to create the class, init to initialize it, and then once it's done, it will actually call this delete method. So you can see that there's a whole life cycle here, right? It gets created, it gets initialized, and then it gets deleted. So all of that is happening every time you create a class, even though it's not really visible to you. And there are special cases where you might want to do things here. We're obviously most familiar here doing stuff with init, but there are cases where you'd want to do something at this phase in the cycle or at this phase in the cycle. So that's basically what a life cycle is. And React has the same kind of thing. You create a component. React has its own machinery for managing stuff. And when you create a component, it will execute a series of method calls in a particular order. And just like Python, you can hook into the new or the init or the del or whatever. You can do the same thing with React. And there are, reasons why you might want to do that. Okay, so let's switch back to React here, and I'm just going to run this application. Okay, so this is the same application, I think on Tuesday. So this is just the state abbreviator. So to review, we start with the app.js. This app component renders the selector component. The selector component is going to render this display info component, and also these this menu, this drop-down menu. So we have like the outer frame with the select, and then the get options is going to dynamically generate all of the individual options. And this is coming from state data, which is just getting read from it's not a JSON object, but basically a JSON. So it's a JavaScript object, which is basically JSON. Okay, so it's reading this, it's generating this, and display info is rendering, not rendering, it's gonna use props to display whatever the current abbreviation is. And it's also rendering this component. So we're like 4 layers deep now to GetFact. And GetFact is going to render a button, which if you press it, we'll make an API call and then display whatever information it gets. So we can see here's the hierarchy, app selector, display info, and GetFact. So if I switch District of Columbia, the button changes here and the current abbreviation changes here, and we can look at all of these things. We have selector, doesn't take any props, it has state. And we can change that here. So you can change that here. So we can play around with this on the in the DevTools. Display info takes props. So it's kind of a passive component. It just takes props right here. So current abbreviation. And then GetFact, which has props, which it keeps getting passed down. So it starts, props start at the selector, it gets passed down to display info and then passed down to GetFact. So you'll see as you get more complicated, you might find that you're passing the same prop down several levels. Maybe, you know, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so we have this prop, and then we have state, which in this case is just 3 dots until we click this, and then the state changes to whatever we get back from our API call. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, so what I want to do now, so we're making an API call here, but this API call is dependent on a user action. So if the user clicks, then we make an API call. So we just call this function and we change state. So this is kind of normal stuff, right? The component loads and renders on the page, and then we just kind of sit there waiting for an event to happen. And when the event happens, we call this function in response. This function changes the state. The state change triggers a re-render. And then when it re-renders, it has the updated, info right there. And that's what's displayed. What if, for example, we weren't getting our initial state data from some static file that we have, but we had to make an API call to get that. So this introduces a complication because we need to fetch the state data automatically. And we're going to be changing, so it's asynchronous, and we're going to be changing our component. So the problem is if you try to make an API call, and if you just make an asynchronous API call when the component is rendering initially, it might not have access to everything you need to have access to. So the short answer is that you can't really do that. You can't just throw in stuff where you want it. You have to play along with the way React structures its life cycle. So if you want to make an API call to get the state data when a component loads, you're going to have to tap into the lifecycle. So there are a whole bunch of methods. So maybe I'll just look these up. So the documentation is pretty good for React. Let's see. So yeah, you can play around with this. It might be better to look at the API reference, but there's a whole bunch of these, and they're very explicitly named. So there's component did mount, component will unmount. Component did mount is actually what we're going to be paying attention to now. But so React, when you first load the page, React will mount your component. And once it's mounted, it will call component did mount. So if you want to do something right after your component is mounted, you want to be sure that everything is loaded and everything is available to you, then component did mount is the place in the lifecycle that you want to hook into or grab onto and do stuff. There's a whole bunch of other ones. You can take a look at them, but this is the only one we're going to be concerned with now. And this is frankly the main one that you'll use. So if you want to do any kind of basically like side effect or API call, then component did mount is where you're going to want to do that. So we can do that here. We can override component did mount. And I'm just going to console log at first. Okay, so I go back here to my application and I check the console. So let me refresh one more time. And component did mount is called. Okay, so we have component did mount getting called here. Now, let's say that we don't have access to state data. Instead, we're going to have to fetch this. So I found another API which has the same information. So we can check that out. Let's look at this API real quick. So I have an add-on that formats JSON a little bit better. So this is, if you don't have that, it's just a mass of text. So this is not even close to the worst JSON you'll ever see. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here. It's actually fairly flat in structure. But what we care about is the state, which is actually the abbreviation, and then the name here, which is Alaska. So we're going to use this API to grab name and state. Okay, so we're gonna have to make a few changes here. One, this get options is not really gonna work anymore because we can't just map over the state data directly. So I'm gonna comment that out. What we're gonna have to do is once our component is mounted, we're gonna have to make the API call, fetch the data, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, so we have component did mount. So here we're just gonna make a normal API call. And if we're making an API call, that's going to have to, that's an asynchronous operation. So component did mount is not, it's not asynchronous, but we can make it asynchronous. So async. So here's the anonymous function that we're going to assign to component did mount. We're going to make it asynchronous, and we'll just do the usual fetch stuff. Okay, so I'm going to do await. And I'll convert the body basically to JSON. And then once I have that, I'm going to have to pick through what I want. So I'm just going to console log. Do that at first. All right. I'm gonna have to comment some stuff out for now. All right, so we've got this stuff that we don't need all of it, obviously. So I'm gonna grab state and name. And I'd like to, you don't have to, but I'm gonna basically reuse the same structure. So I'm gonna want our state data to be a list of dictionaries, basically, with these two keys, or at least two keys. So to do that, I'm gonna use map. So body.map, and it's going to map over every single state object. And what I want is to create an object here, and I'm going to have two keys. One will be name, and the other one will be state. So state, I think, is actually the abbreviation. I'm going to call it brief. Okay. And just, I'm going to have to add extra brackets here just to fit the requirements of the syntax. Let's see.
Does name and abbreviation have to be a string?
No. So, but they belong to state objects, so I just forgot to include that. Okay, so all I'm doing is getting that JSON object, and I'm mapping over it to pull out just the name and the abbreviation and the name that I want. So once I have that, I'll console log it just so you can see it. Okay. So this looks right. So name and abbreviation. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create a bunch of options with this new parsed thing. So does anyone know how I might possibly go about doing that? So the component is already mounted. It's already sitting on the page. Once it's on the page, I make an API call and I get some data back, and I want to change what's on the page.
An event handler?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good thought. The thing is that I don't really, so an event is typically something that like a user would do. So if a user clicks something or moves their mouse somewhere, but in this case, I'm not really waiting on a user event. I'm waiting on this API call to return. So if I want to change something in a component, where do I have to do that?
I was going to say,
Oh,
go ahead, David.
I was just gonna say state is where you change something in a component.
Yeah. So even if we don't know how exactly we're going to go about it, we know that somehow we're going to have to get parsed into state. Because that's how you change. If there's something in a component that changes and you want that change to be reflected in the UI, then you're going to have to change state. You either change state or you change props, but we're not dealing with props right now.
I've
So
got a question.
yeah.
When state changes, like anytime it changes for any reason, does it automatically call a re-render?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I can't say that's 100% true, I think, because React has its own way of managing it, but I think that's basically true. I think there are cases where React will basically like batch updates. So you might not necessarily get one re-render per state change.
Okay.
But yeah, that's more of just like FYI. Okay, so I have this parse data, it comes back. So I'm gonna have to have a new state object. So I'm just gonna call it state data. Use camel case. And I know that state data is going to be an array of objects. So I can just kind of do that. You don't have to do this. You could make this, undefined or really whatever you want, but this is kind of just a type signature almost. So we know that state data is going to be an array of objects. So once I get back this, then I can change my state. So the component mounts, once a component mounts, this lifecycle method will get called. And since we're overriding it, this stuff that we're running is going to get called. It's going to make a network request. It's going to get a result back. Once it gets the result back, we're going to change our state based on the result. And when we change our state, the state change is going to trigger a re-render, which is going to update our component. So we should be able to display it with the new information. So let's parse. So this that state, and you don't have to. So our state has two things in it, but when we set state, we don't have to like reset the entire thing. You can just set one piece and React will merge it together. State data is okay. So let's see what that looks like. So now I'm going to go into the components. I go into select there, and I can see, even though my my UI, my HTML hasn't changed at all, I can, using the dev tools, I can see that my state is actually updated. So my state actually has the correct stuff that I want now. So that's all working so far. Now I have to take whatever's in state and put it into get options. So here we can more or less just go back to the way we had it before. So this, we're going to map over everything in our state data, which is names and abbreviations. So we can basically keep this as is, except this is not state data. It's going to be this .state data. And this is not alpha 2. I think it's state.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Okay, because you did the component did mount,
Yeah.
everything inside of that function is automatically going to be uploaded to state.
Yeah. So this function is going to be run. So like when you first go to the page, or like I refresh the page and that first load, that's when ComponentMount is going to get called. So if I refresh the page, my component, the selector component, loads into the DOM. Once that is there, then React will call ComponentMount. So React is going to call this method no matter what. Even if I don't override it, it's still going to call it. But it's available for for me or us to override.
So my question was, so once that component did mount is loaded, it's automatically saved to the state.
Yes, so the component mounts, when the component is mounts, React will call component did mount. That's gonna run our code here, which is gonna make the API request, and then we're calling set state. So after the component is mounted, component did mount gets called, we change the state. So we'll update the state. That state change will trigger a re-render, which will then re-render our component, in this case, with the new stuff on it.
Gotcha, thank you.
So I'll save this, and it should be working as it was before. So we have all these states. So if I choose Louisiana, okay, so we don't have the abbreviation. Might need to fix this. Maybe this is, oh, I called it,
So a breve with no E.
yeah,
ABB.
thank you. Is that it, or this was, yeah.
Name and a breed.
Okay. So now we, this looks exactly the same, except instead of getting it from a file that we have locally, we're making an API call. So this is the pattern that you use basically if you want to make an API call. So if I have my web application and I have a little like widget in the corner that gives me the current weather or something like that, when I go to the page, that call is just going to go out immediately and fetch the information. So that's when here is where you would do that. The component did mount. Are there any questions about that?
No.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now, so we did this using a class component. So I'm now going to do the same thing, but use a functional component. It's slightly different, but same basic idea. So I'm just going to comment all this out. I'll end up reusing most of this, but you're going to create a functional component, and you can mix and match class and functional components. So you don't have to just choose one. So even in the same application, you can have a mix. Okay, so this one's called selector. Okay, and I'm going to end up returning some JSX. So I'll do that. So there's no render method, but you're still going to return something from a function. So I'm going to end up copying some of this and then having to make some changes. So first off, let's see. Well, we're not going to have this, right? Because we're in a component. So let's see. So handle change, that should be still the same. I'm just going to copy this and then we'll restructure it a little bit. Component didn't mount. Yeah, I'll comment all this and we'll change it. Okay, so this is a little bit of a mess, but we're gonna change things one at a time here. All right, so the first thing we're gonna change is the state. So if we have a class-based component, we get this state thing, which we have for free, and we just make it an object basically, and that's it. With a functional component, you don't just get it for free, you're gonna have to import it. And the React hooks generally start with use. So use whatever, use state, use effect. So those are the two that we're gonna concentrate on now. So we're gonna import from React, use state, and I'll also just import use effect because we're gonna need that as well. So I'm going to take state and comment this out. Does anyone know how I can create functional state? You guys have seen this before. I mean, Tom showed you this, right?
Yeah, this is, I forget what it's called. It's where you do like the bracketed
Yep.
equals use state.
Structure.
Yeah. Okay. So we get some destructuring syntax here. So there are, first off, let's talk about what this does. So use state. I'm going to call use state, and use state is going to return two things. So what are the two things that use state is going to return?
Like a name and a function.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to return whatever the state is, like the one particular item of state. In this case, I'll just keep it. So this will be called current. And the second thing is a function that will allow you to update the state. And
So set current.
yeah, so you can call this whatever you want, but conventionally you prefix it with set. So set current. So you have the state, and then you have the function that will change the state. So you call use state will return two things, and you just destructure them so you can pull them out by name. So if we didn't do it this way, we could call something like and then you could do res, whatever. You could individually assign them. So this is just convenience. It saves you, a couple lines of code. Okay, so use state. So one difference between class-based state and functional state is that you get one at a time. So I get one thing, one item of state, and one function to modify that. We have two things here, so we're going to have to actually repeat ourselves. Const. This will be state data set state. All right.
At times, do you when you maybe not in this instance, but you would set an initial value sometimes and set use state.
Okay, good. So how do we set an initial? So here we have like an initial value of California, and then we have this.
Just put it
array.
inside that use state.
Yeah. Okay, so you can do that here. So you can make that the initial value. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to go through and refactor this to update. So now we have, it's not this.state.current, it's just current. And it's not this.state.state data, it's just state data. So I'm going to go here. Just remove all the this.state.whatevers. So current. Okay, good. And then might as well, so we're inside of a function now. So we don't get this kind of shorthand method syntax. So we're gonna have to define these things. So I'm just gonna add that. ComponentMount is not gonna work, but we'll just leave it like that. Okay. And then here, this handle change is not going to be this handle change because we have no this, or at least this is not what we want it to be. And just get options. Okay, so this handle change. How do we change our state? So when we had a functional, or sorry, when we had a class-based component, we called this dot set state, and we updated it. How do we change our current?
You use the set current and the set state data.
Yeah, exactly. So we can actually shorten this up a little bit. Handle change. So we're going to call set current, and we're just going to call so handle change. You don't have to call this dot set state and then pass an object, because set current is responsible just for one thing. So we just pass in that one thing directly. So whatever e.target.value is going to be the new current state. Okay, let's see if any of this renders so far. So I have two hooks. I have this state. So one downside is that the dev tools aren't as useful. So hooks, this is just, you know, a thing of states, so we don't get a name for free. I think there's a way to do that, but so we have the abbreviation, and then we have our list, which is empty right now. And then the other components are just the way they were before. Okay, so get options is currently mapping over basically nothing. And so that's why we don't have any options. So what we need to do now is we don't get a component did mount. So we don't get that for free. Instead, we get something called UseEffect, which is actually more general than component did mount. So UseEffect. UseEffect. So there are a whole bunch of lifecycle methods. You can look at them. UseEffect is basically a combination of 2 or 3 lifecycle methods. And one of them is component did mount. So UseEffect will takes one mandatory parameter, and that parameter, surprise, surprise, is a function. So UseEffect takes a callback function, and UseEffect, as it is right now, will run when the component is first mounted, and also anytime it is re-rendered. So anytime state or props changes, this UseEffect will get called, and anytime, basically when it first renders, UseEffect will also get called. So that's what it does by default. You can control that, but that's what it does by default. So here is where we're going to put our API call. Unfortunately, we can't directly mark this callback function as being asynchronous. So we're going to have to define another function inside this callback function that's going to make our actual API call. So let's see. Okay, so that get data is going to be something, and I'm going to call get data. And I'm going to copy all this stuff out. Put it in here. So UseEffect will get run. It's going to call this function, which we'll call this function get data, which is going to run and just get all of the stuff that we did before. Then once it has parsed, what are we gonna have to do? Once we have our list of state names and abbreviations.
Update state data.
Yeah. And how do we update the state data?
Set state data.
Yeah. So no calling this dot set state blah blah, just directly, this is the function that we got. So let's use it. So set state data, and we can just pass in whatever we want our new state data to be. Okay. So that's pretty much it. There's something that I'm going to talk about. So controlling this UseEffect. So let's think about what's going to happen here. So the component initially mounts. The selector component initially mounts, and when it initially mounts, UseEffect is going to get called. So UseEffect is going to get called. It's going to run this, which is going to change our state. And what happens when our state changes?
Re-render.
Yeah, it's going to trigger a re-render, which is going to trigger this UseEffect call. So the UseEffect will get called again. So UseEffect will run, and UseEffect is going to change the state, which is going to cause a re-render, which means UseEffect is going to get called again, and so on and so forth. So you're just going to get this infinite loop of API calls, which means you're going to get, someone's going to think you're DDoSing them or something like that. So this is something you have to worry about with React. It's easy, relatively easy to get into infinite loops or infinite re-rendering loops. So it's something you have to watch out for. So how do we avoid this problem? Where when the component first loads, UseEffect is going to be called, which we want, because it's going to fetch our data for us. But we don't want it to keep running all the time. So when we had our class-based component did mount only gets called on that first mount. So that's exactly what we wanted to happen. So this is like purpose-built for our purpose, right? It's purpose-built. UseEffect, we're gonna have to, because it does several things, we have to tweak it a little bit. So there's a second optional parameter you can give UseEffect, which is called a dependency list. So this dependency list is going to basically modify when UseEffect will run. So if we don't pass it anything, it's going to run all the time. Anytime there's a change, it's going to run, which might be what you want, depending, or might not. You can also add conditionals in here. So if you can control what gets rendered. So, if something, then call this, otherwise don't do anything. So you can also control it that way. Here we're going to pass, if we pass in an empty array, then it's going to act just like component did mount. So an empty array means only run on that initial render, run, and that's it. So let's see what this looks like. So if I refresh, let's see the selector. So I have my state, California, and then my state. So I can see everything's loaded into the state properly. The current state is California. If I click a new one, so my state changes to Guam, everything else updates. So everything is now working the way it was before. And I can go to the profiler, and I'm going to clear this. I'll refresh the page. I'm going to start profiling. I'll click a state. Okay. I'll click this. I'll stop. So I look at the profiler. I can see the app didn't render because I'm not changing. App's just a container, so it's not doing anything interesting. Selector. selector re-rendered. Why? Because hook 1 changed. So this is, again, one downside of the functional components. What is hook 1? Hook 1, I think, is this current. So current change, which means I selected something from the drop-down menu, and that changed what the current, the currently selected state was. And then display info also changed because the props changed. Now, if I take off this and try to do this quickly so I don't get. Okay, I'll re-render this, clear this. Stop this. I can see that, look at all these re-renders. It's just like infinite. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to have, your app making infinite API calls, for, I don't know how many times a millisecond, for as long as the person has the browser open. So you want to like check that, because there's nothing like, it's not going to necessarily throw an error. Like everything is working. You're just caught in an infinite render loop. So it's good to use the dev tools to just monitor to make sure you're not doing that stuff. Console logging also can help, but so just keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and fix this real quick. So I'm going to re-add the empty dependency array. And I can rerun this, and I should avoid the infinite loop issue. Go back to the profiler, clear it, I'll refresh, start profiling, click something, and stop. And I can see it just rendered once here. Display info just rendered once. GetFact just actually rendered twice. Let me see. Right. Okay. So GetFact rendered twice. So the first time, if we look at GetFact, can someone explain to me basically the order of events for GetFact? So just to refresh your memory, so GetFact is kind of at the bottom of this hierarchy. So app renders selector, selector renders display info renders GetFact. So GetFact re-rendered twice. So can anyone tell me why, or just walk me through what happened? Or start, or give me some version of events.
Are you asking why it rendered twice?
Yeah. So kind of, what I'm asking is to like, walk me through the code in slow motion. So why did GetFact render twice, and what happened to cause it?
I think it rendered twice because it rendered when it first mounted, and then during the mount, it had the asynchronous API call, which updated state, which caused another re-render.
Okay, so here's the, so this is the, here's the button, and then this display info has this button with an event listener. So the first time it mounts, and that basically doesn't count. So the first time the page displays, that doesn't count. The first time it changed because the props changed. So we look at GetFact. what props does GetFact take or use?
Well, it's using the data from the API call from the other component.
Yes. Yes. Well, so indirectly, yes. So we look at selector. Selector has its own state, and it will pass whatever the current state is, right? Passes that to display info. So when a selector component mounts, UseEffect gets called. It makes this API call. It changes the state, the set state data, which then is available in the get options call, which is going to create our drop-down menu. So that drop-down menu is created now. And the current abbreviation is, it starts out as California. So that actually doesn't matter. So that's the initial starting conditions. Then once someone clicks on this drop-down menu and this onChange event triggers, the onChange handler is going to get called, which is going to change our state here. So if I, if it starts at California and I click on Georgia or something, this state will change, which triggers a re-render of selector. So selector re-renders with now Georgia as current. And it re-renders and it passes the new updated props to display info. So display info starts as California, and now it's getting changed to Georgia. So display info will get re-rendered because its props changed. So display info re-renders. Now this .props.abbrev is Georgia, but it also re-renders GetFact for the exact same reason, because the props changed. So these are like secondhand props, but still props. So GetFact gets new props, which means it re-renders. So that's why that first re-rendering is happening. The second re-render happens for a different reason. So the first re-render is because the props changed. I clicked something new and the props changed. The second one is because the state changed. So here, so GetFact accepts props, which means it's changeable when its parent component changes. It's also changeable internally because it has state. So when I click on this button, I make this API call, which changes the state, which triggers a re-render. So when I click on this, it makes the API call, it changes the state, which triggers a re-render, but it only re-renders this component, right? So none of the other components, even though this one changed the second time, none of the other components changed again. So this one didn't affect anything else because it was at the bottom of the hierarchy. So it wasn't passing props to anything else. Does that not make sense to anyone? I know there's a lot involved. There's a lot of steps, but I think I obviously strongly recommend using the dev tools to help you kind of think through what's actually happening and what's causing what. Okay, so the UseEffect. So here, if we have this empty dependency array, if we have nothing, it's going to get called every time there's a change, which we don't want in this case. We have an empty array, it's only going to get called on that first amount. We can also pass in specific things. So if we want this to get called every time current changes, we can pass in current. And now UseEffect will get called on the initial render and then anytime current changes. And you can pass in multiple values here. So that's the basic idea. We'll talk more about lifecycle stuff in the future. But so I'll also say that this pattern of making that in an initial API call when your component first loads is 90% of what you need to do. So use state, use effect. This basic pattern is pretty much all you're going to need to do. And same thing with this lifecycle method, the component did mount lifecycle method. There's a whole bunch of others. Most of the other ones are like have very specific use cases. All right, any questions about that?
I have a quick question. When we're doing the assignments, do you guys have a preference for classes or functional?
No, I mean, so it's really up to you. So for the last 2 or 3 years, React has been definitely moving in a functional direction, but I think they've made it pretty clear that they're not going to deprecate class-based components or anything like that. And so if you end up getting a job doing React stuff, there's a good chance that you're going to be working with a pre-existing code base, which means there's a good chance that you're going to be dealing probably with a combination of classes and functions. So you basically, it's kind of an awkward spot, but it's best to at least be familiar with both, but you can kind of do what you like. If you think it's probably, yeah, it's probably better to focus on functional components because that's just, the current thing.
So it's okay if we turn an assignment and it's done in both classes and functional?
Yeah. I mean, basically, you can do whatever you want as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Chad, I have a quick question.
Sure.
With existing React code, will there ever be a requirement to try and change a class into a function? Or just kind of build off of that class, you think?
Yeah, so I think, React's official recommendation is if you're writing something new, use functions, otherwise just kind of leave it alone. But that depends on where you work. So oftentimes things like refactoring old code is, that's like on the back burner. It's like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could go back and refactor all of our old React code? But probably, I mean, if it's anything like, probably that it's just going to be a low priority thing, and there's probably just not going to be time for it. So
Okay.
you might end up doing some refactoring, but probably old stuff is just going to more or less stay how it is, as long as it works.
Okay, thank you.
I got a question. Can the asynchronous function get data be defined outside of UseEffect and called?
Yeah, I think so. So you could do something like, yeah.
Nice.
All right, anything else? Okay, well, so that's it for this lecture. I'll let Omar. Omar, do you have an idea for when you'd like to do your class?